You're tuning into the Active Mom Podcast with physical therapist Dr. Carrie Pagliano, a real mom's guide to all things postpartum return to workouts after baby. If you're a postpartum mom, coach, trainer, or physical therapist looking for answers on how to get back to running, CrossFit, yoga, Pilates, HIIT, you name it, without the fear of pelvic floor issues or doing something wrong, this is the podcast for you. Let's start the show. As a physical therapist, there's nothing I love more than having a plan that works and a client with results that makes them jump literally for joy without the wet pants, without any pain, and without feeling like their organs are going to fly out of their body. If you're a postpartum coach, trainer, or physical therapist like me, and you want to get those results that are going to make you jump for joy, make sure to get on the wait list for the Real Mom's Guide to Postpartum Return to Run Pro Edition coming in September. Go to course.carriepagliano.com/R2R Pro22 to get on the wait list now. Can't wait to see you there. All right, welcome back to the Active Mom Postpartum Podcast. I'm your host, Carrie Pagliano, and we're here for another solo episode. This one, I think we've chatted about it with a couple of guests about the 12-week recommendation and guideline as far as return to run. And I wanted to dive into this because in general pelvic floor PT, one, there's more women that are getting educated and going to see a pelvic floor PT either before they deliver, after delivery, somewhere, after the baby's been born. And I think there's just more information available on social media, and this keeps coming up. And even like face groups that I'm on, I see like the average person saying, oh, wait till 12 weeks, when somebody's like, oh, 3 weeks, I feel great. And somebody's like, oh, no, you got to wait till 12 weeks. And I wanted to kind of back up and talk a little bit about the history and then where that guideline or recommendation, we have to remember that it's a guideline. Sometimes we might go sooner, sometimes we might go later. And unfortunately, that's going to require us to think. And that's hard. I'm not going to lie. That's hard for the average person. We would really like to just be like, hey, just do this and everything's fine. The problem is there's literally like 70,000 variables that are involved as far as return to run. Now, I do think it's fair to say there could be some parallels if you're, in the lifting world or CrossFit world or that sort of thing. I think there's some places to draw some parallels and some comparisons, but it's not going to be exactly the same. But I think filter-wise, overarching concepts. So let's back up for a second and let's talk about like pre-2019. And the reason I bring that up is because we didn't have anything. And so when I talk to people and they're frustrated, I've talked to some pro athletes that have had children recently, and they're just frustrated that there's no specific do this workout. This is what your, running progression should look like. This is what your fueling should look like. They're frustrated by that. But the fact of the matter is, again, 70 million variables. So prior to 2019, and I remember this very distinctly, is and this is again even what I went through myself. My kids were born in 11 and 13, 2011, 2013. I remember having patients and being really excited that they wanted to get back to running and they had leakage or prolapse symptoms or some other issue. I'm like, great. I don't really know what to do with you. And I apologize. And there's a few people I'm thinking of in my head that I will forever be sorry, because we just didn't have that information. We knew that there was something we could do, that we knew that there was something that wasn't right about that. And some of that also, and I'm going to step back even a little bit further. I think there's still a lot that we are learning about the morphology of the pelvic floor, the functioning of the pelvic floor in normal activities like running. We don't have enough research there. We're starting to get a little bit more in normals versus people who have leakage symptoms or prolapse symptoms or things like that. And so with those things in mind, we said, go run, see what happens. And really the options that we had were, okay, do some strengthening, which again, runners don't tend to want to do. but we had no ability to screen. And I would say probably like mid 2000s, um, I became aware, I think it was Jade DeSherry's work. He had done some presentations at some national conferences about like a 5-step screening for return to run readiness from just regular sport perspective. And I do think this was included in the guidelines from the UK with Grania Donnelly, Emma Brockwell, and Tom Goom. And we've had Emma and Grania on the podcast a couple of times to talk about that. Um, and I remember, I think it was literally, wall sit. I think it was hopping in place, full plank, side plank. I feel like there was something else. Maybe it was a bridge, single leg bridge or something like that. And that was kind of, we didn't have anything. And I remember seeing this and being like, all right, I got nothing else. And we're using this to get back to running after, you know, Achilles tendinopathy, knee injuries, hip injuries, that sort of thing. Let's just try it and see what happens. And ironically, I was not the only one doing that. And that's the cool thing about the internet is before we were on social media 24/7, we didn't know that other people were kind of thinking the same thing. So when you run into people that you respect their thought process and you realize that they were kind of looking at it the same way, it kind of makes you feel a little bit smart for half a second. But you have to think that there's something to it that all of us are like, hey, there's got to be some way to screen this out and do better. But again, like back then, it was like, okay, don't do a single thing until after that 6-week clearance. And then at that point, then we can start to figure out what to do from there. But there wasn't any sense of 6 weeks, 8 weeks, like nothing. It was like, oh, go run and see how it goes. So some of us started to do some screening. And then in 2019, the UK guidelines came out. And again, understanding what those guidelines are, it's not written in stone. It's not meant to be the 10 commandments. It's, hey, here's some things that we extrapolated when really there's no specific data or papers that are pointing to what we actually want to find out. They pulled from return to sport for female athlete. They pulled from, some of the stuff that I was kind of looking at as far as general return to run. And again, if we're looking back at the methodology on a lot of this stuff, they didn't dissect out back in the day females versus males. Like that's the first thing I go to now. Is, what are you even looking at women because we're not the same and we shouldn't be treated as the same. Just like we know it's very obvious that treating a postpartum woman is not the same as treating just you know, a return to running after ACL injury or something like that. But we didn't have anything. So they had to start from somewhere, which um I guess is as good a place of any. And so the guidelines came out looking at adding some other screening items, looking at broad jump, looking at ankle strength, heel raise. That was the other one, I think in JD Sherry's, which I think is incredibly important because it just opened our eyes to start to pay attention beyond the pelvic floors. Like, let's look other places. Let's consider what is the impact on the pelvic floor if the leg and the calf aren't mitigating forces the way they need to. Does the pelvic floor end up, I say it ends up like the mom of the body that's like, all right, if y'all aren't doing it, I guess I'm doing. And that's where we end up with issues. So we've got this culmination of, okay, we don't know that much about what the pelvic floor actually does, period. And I would go so far as to say now we understand the mechanisms of stress urinary incontinence completely different now than even just like 10 years ago. We didn't really have a screening process and we didn't really have a way to progress people back. But we had a lot of this information we could just sort of mash up, and a lot of it I think has been just us playing in the clinic and figuring out, okay, this gives me information, this doesn't. The other thing that we know about soft tissue healing is generally at 6 weeks we're well on our way. I think it's around 75% soft tissue healing at that point. By 12 weeks we should be good to go. But again, this is just general principles. We don't have any specific data to speak to perineal scar healing rate or C-sections where you've got multiple layers, organs got cut into, like, we don't have that data. So we're just kind of, my joke is I would take whatever data I could find and just bastardize the hell out of it and see what happens. Because again, like there's no other choice at this point. So that's kind of where I think we started having the conversation about postpartum return to run and that 12-week mark. Um, At that point, so if we flash back to 2019, 2020, um, again, I don't know that, a lot of people were sharing as much information as they are now on social media. I think that's relevant because, we didn't have as many people having access to that. I don't think we had as many providers, hyper niching in female athlete, postpartum pregnancy, return to run, return to sport kind of practices, to be quite honest with you. I remember being very, very alone that that was my niche. And now I can scroll on social media and pull up like five or six in about 10 seconds. So I think all of those things are incredibly important to understanding, kind of the space that we were in. And then if let's jump ahead to where we are now in 2024. Um, it's our first Olympics coming up where we have equal number of women and men, not participating, but the number of events is equal. If we look at even just the last year in running events, we're getting a little bit more, symmetry and equality as far as media coverage. Take the Boston Marathon recently, we got a little bit more even coverage. We're getting more media kind of reporting on both. I just listened to a podcast the other night talking about ultra running, that there's some disparity there too. But I think there's, other than women not getting representation, I think there's a whole lot of other issues as far as representation in ultra. That's another conversation. Um, but I think we have more women um, in pro sport that are performing at a high level. And I think we have more women in pro sport that are sharing their pregnancy and postpartum journeys, what went right and what didn't go right. And I think that's also a point that we need to acknowledge, um, knowing that there's some comparison going on and knowing, again, everybody's got access to all this information. Me as a postpartum mom, am I going to turn to my favorite, you know, marathoner that I fangirl over, my ultra runner, that kind of thing? Am I going to fangirl over them and then try and figure out what they did, and have that be my return to run plan? Or do I take some time and effort and figure out what's going on with my own situation, understanding the full fact that I am not a award-winning ultra or marathoner or racer, and I'm just a recreational runner. Um, so I think, and I want to bring up a kind of a specific case. I was reading through some social media posts from Creth Arnold. She just got fourth at Canyon's 100K recently, and she's was able. There was a golden ticket that rolled down. For those of you that don't know ultra running, I'm just becoming obsessed with it. One, because it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, but there's no stigma about talking about nutrition and fueling. Um, but it's a long ass way to run. I'm not gonna lie about that. Like, I wish I had that capacity, don't have it right now, but I'm kind of in awe of it. And she was very open with her, second pregnancy. She ran a 50-mile race at 14 weeks, and she's like, "Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it." And then delivery, didn't really talk much about that. And then at 8 weeks, talked about, oh, I've got some hip soreness. My pelvic floor reminds me. I've got sleep deprivation. I'm navigating breastfeeding. She's talking about that a little bit and saying, hey, I'm just trying to feel this out. And then did a 50K at 9 weeks, placed fourth. But talked about, I've got some looseness in my hip, especially from relaxing from breastfeeding. We'll put a pin in that one and come back to it. But my mobility exercises help. This is what my fueling is. If you've got questions about pregnancy, postpartum, return to run, DM me, let me know. So we've got that. And then, other examples, if we're going to, bridge over into the CrossFit community, Annie Thorisdottir just had her second. She's been incredibly open about her workouts during pregnancy and her concerns about another vaginal delivery. She opted to have a C-section second time around. And then in comparison, we've got Tia Toomey, six-time fittest in the world, really not saying anything, but selling a postpartum program. So there's a lot out there in the pro sports world, and I'm just kind of cherry picking some larger examples. Um, Steph Bruce, we've had her on the podcast. She was very methodical about her return to run, working with a pelvic floor PT, and a postpartum run coach on her third return back. And she just won Pittsburgh half marathon, I think, last weekend. So there's a lot of examples that are out there. And I think what's really hard is for the average pregnant or postpartum mom to be like, all right, now what do I do? You've probably heard about the 12-week guidance. You've got these pro runners that are going back really quick. And then trying to figure out kind of where we find ourselves in all of this. And to be quite honest, that's where, again, I think it's important to understand what your motivation is. And I say that in the kindest possible way because I don't think it's good or bad. I think it's just, what do you need to know about yourself? Brandon Battles talks a lot about athlete mindset. I think that's incredibly important. I think what number pregnancy this is incredibly important because by the time you've gone through it once before, I think you have a sense of, what you're going into as opposed to the first time around. It's a little bit more idealistic and a lot of variables that you may not be aware of how you're going to process them. And then there's also the big kind of elephant in the room of, how does pregnancy go? How does the delivery go? Are there any other medical things going on? And what's going on with your baby as far as sleep, nutrition, any other medical issues, that kind of stuff too. And that changes. And so you kind of have to understand where you are in all of that. But then chances are, if you have continued to work out and that's a huge priority, there may also be a mental health component to this. And that was one thing that I wanted to bring up. And I just bring up Kareth just because it's a recent example. And she, has this well documented in her posts. When she posted at 8 weeks, she's got this stuff going on. She's like, but this is, I got the impression she mentioned postpartum depression, like people that are pro runners, like that's their identity. That's who they are. There's a lot of us who working out and running and stuff, that's a part of our identity. And a lot of people do manage mental health concerns with over exercising. And so we have to kind of understand that as well, because then that brings up the whole waterfall of uh, low energy availability, or REDS, which is relative energy deficiency. We're looking at it postpartum in a low estrogen state when you're lactating. We know we're getting some draw from the bones, and so we might have some concerns about bone stress injuries, if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not getting good fueling, all that kind of stuff. So with all of this information out there, it's really kind of hard to, I think, for the average person to figure out where to turn for advice. And if we want to go even bigger, the average American doesn't exercise enough anyway. We already have childcare issues and access to good postpartum healthcare in a timely manner. We've got, like, on one end of the spectrum, we've got kind of the average American that we really need to exercise a lot more. And then on the other end of it, we have like the pro athlete that's getting back to running at at 3 weeks, and this is their day job, and they, we talk about bone health and nutrition and fueling and overloading and that kind of stuff. So there's so many things along that spectrum, and you kind of have to start by figuring out where you fit, and what your concerns are. And I think the first kind of screening item to be like, all right, this is going to give me a sense of where I'm going to be in that 12-week spectrum, is what's going on from a post-delivery kind of physiology, health, sort of even mental health scenario for you and the baby, because that needs to be addressed first. I think when you don't have those issues, you're going to jump to that conversation of um, getting back to running at 3 weeks. If your baby sleeps, if your baby eats, if you don't have to worry about colic, if you don't have to worry about, diaper issues, hamburger nipples, like, if you don't have those issues, you're gonna turn to the conversation of, "Oh, can I do this sooner?" Because you're going to be feeling better. And I think that's an important thing to consider when you're playing the comparison game, whether it's, pro athletes or somebody that you just follow on Instagram that kind of looks and feels like you. Um, I think we've got enough sense, and there's some research to look at this as far as, mom comparison. If it's like an influencer or somebody in pro, like I think we have a sense of like, okay, maybe I'm not them. We'll pull a few tidbits from there. But if it's something that looks like, the average person, we might compare and have a little bit more impact on our self-esteem. And that's where I'm incredibly mindful that yes, I have letters behind my name. This is my day job, that sort of thing. But I'm also the average mom, like physically, there ain't nothing special here, like, not at all. Um, and so from a relatability perspective, I understand that people might look at my personal journey a little bit differently. So when you are looking and doing that comparison game, and again, assuming people are telling the whole story, chances are if they're going back sooner, this is my opinion, um, there's probably nothing going on physically. Or if there is, they're ignoring it and there's much bigger concerns that are more mental health. Like if I don't get out there, it's going to be bad. The other thing to consider too is they probably have help to delegate and to give that infant to while they go out and exercise. Maybe it's their day job. And there's probably not issues as far as the baby is concerned. So I think those are really, really important things. Then we can start to have the conversation of, do we want to do this sooner? And I've had plenty of clients that that's the case. They have a relatively easy delivery. As far as symptoms go, things are fine. Baby's sleeping, feeding good, like that kind of stuff. We can have that conversation much sooner. When I love to have that initial conversation is 2 to 3 weeks after delivery. I schedule that while moms are pregnant and we try and, give them a couple weeks after that due date or induction or whatever that's going to be. So we can have that conversation and be like, all right, there was that piece of information we didn't have. Now we have it. Now what do we do? And typically the first thing, and I've talked about this before, I think on the last solo episode, is we want to get that coordination. We want to get all this stuff back. If all that is on lock, and again, I've had patients that that's the case. And here's the thing too, it's not always the ones that worked out all the way through pregnancy. Sometimes it's the ones that had to stop 20 weeks through and just walk the rest of the time or did some lightweight workouts or things like that. Like we don't have a way to predict that yet. So for those of you that, and I see this a lot too, did all the right things in pregnancy and then you're devastated that something's messed up in postpartum, you didn't do anything wrong. I promise you, we don't have a way to predict that just yet. So great, you did that. Then that's done. And now we kind of move ahead and see kind of what happens after there. So again, back to kind of getting earlier, I have had clients that we decide at that 6 week clearance that things are looking good. And we know about red flags. We are very clear on, okay, let's start walk run. Let's, be aware of all this stuff. And if symptoms come up, wave the flag, let me know. And I think for the average person that may or may not have access to a professional like myself, and I'm sharing this again because not everybody does, for financial, geographic, whatever reason, wherever you are in the world. If you are not having symptoms, leakage, pressure, pain, you're able to walk up to, you know, 30, 40 minutes with a stroller or 30, 40 minutes with a carrier. Everything's feeling good. You're getting sleep, you're getting fueling, you're pooping, all that good stuff. Great. We can have a conversation about going a little bit sooner. So in the situation of kind of the ultra marathoner we talked about sooner, I'm making the assumption that, it's her second time through. She knows what's going on and she started back sooner because she felt like she could. We'll get to some other kind of pieces later on. And again, I'm making assumptions. I don't know anything about this particular situation, but that's okay to start a little sooner. But again, I would want that person to have a really good reason. I would want there to be guidance and supervision. I would want there to be awareness of red, yellow flags instead of just blind, like, hey, I'm just going to run and see how it goes. Like that's circa, early 2000s. Let's not go back. Now, the person that it's probably going to be closer to that 12-week mark, that's going to be the person that maybe has prolapse symptoms right off the bat, or they've got, the regular discharge, but they're noticing maybe a little bit of pee in there. We don't know. a little heaviness, a little pressure, maybe having difficulty with scar healing, whether it's a perineal tearing or C-section, like we know that that might take a little longer. So already with that kind of stuff, we're going to adjust our expectations. Okay. And it's not an automatic, like, hey, 6 weeks, we're good to go. Like or even 12, like we just don't know. And I think that's the thing. It's kind of like that with birth. More rigid you are, it's a old like mindfulness term. Like the more you resist, it persists. Like, don't fight. Be flexible. Like that's mom 101. Um, so let's say we are having those issues. Again, if we're screening it out sooner, and that's what really gets my goat when physicians are like, oh, don't do anything until 6 weeks. I'm like, what if we can address it before? Like, because how far does your brain go down like the scary rabbit hole when you have these symptoms, whether you've had a kid or not? It's not good. Plus, you've got all these other things and so on and so forth. So if we can get that earlier intervention on kind of why this stuff is happening sooner, hey, do we just need to, let the healing happen? Or maybe let's, do a little bit more cardio that is not as gravity dependent, or maybe we just need to focus on more kind of mat strengthening and walking. Like we can make those determinations earlier, which I think, again, if we're talking quality of life, especially for that mom that needs to keep moving for her sanity and has the ability to delegate and that kind of stuff too. Like, I think that's the way to go. Now, I think what gets hard, again, comparison game, is when you have the mom that she wants to do all those things and doesn't have anybody to pass the baby off to. So finding exercises that you can do while the kids are there, breaking it up into small, manageable bites, building those habits where maybe you get up earlier. Kareth mentions, again, I'm just going back to her because she's an example. She mentions, like, I get up at 4. Um, I nurse, I go for my run, and then I'm back to go nurse again. And I was like, yeah, that's what you got to do because you're also a professional ultra runner. That's when your day starts. I think, again, you got to understand what your scenario is, what are your support, what's your resources, when do you have to go back to work, assuming that running is not your day job. How is that going to change as you go back to work? All right. Now, again, at this point, again, it's like, all right, well, what do I focus on? And this is where I think it gets a little tricky because what we do know from the research, I think Shefali Christopher looked at kind of some deficits, pregnant versus not. I think this was in the Journal of Women's and Pelvic Health PT maybe a year or two ago. I mean, it's kind of the general stuff that we expect. So hip weakness, hamstring inflexibility, like core weakness, that kind of stuff. Like nothing earth shattering that we're like, oh, that's new. Um, Jennifer Bagwell, she looked at the difference between running form in pregnant versus postpartum runners. And the big difference there is pregnancy, we don't have a lot of trunk rotation. And then throw us into postpartum and like that internal rigidity that comes from having a baby kind of locking down your trunk is gone. And you don't have core strength and coordination to kind of back it up. So we still kind of run a little rigid in that respect because we don't have that control. So, I mean, I think knowing those things, I think it's generally accepted at this point with most of the general return to run postpartum programs that I'm seeing right now is people are saying, oh, we got to do some core work. We got to do some obliques and some rotation. Great. Fine with that. Hip strength. Totally fine with that. Balance. Totally fine with that. The impact stuff that I see, some of it's a little weird. And a lot of it's slow. And that's where I do think there's a little bit of a gap. But again, it's also like, when do we kind of bring this stuff in? And again, I think Shefali Christopher, they published maybe it was a year ago, a 4-phase approach to return to run. And really, and it's interesting how people use this. I had somebody DM me once and was having difficulty returning to run. Somebody's PT printed that article and handed it to a patient and said, "Here you go." I'm like, no, let's pull out what that person needs. And so, I mean, I think generally we're like, okay, we need to do some strength, we need to do some balance, we need to do hip strength, core strength, that kind of stuff with a walk run program. I think where the confusion lies is how does this all integrate if you do have pelvic floor problems? And then I do think there's some disparity as far as how people speak about gait training and recommendations. And what that is like your running form and that kind of stuff. And I think there's also some confusion as far as like, all right, well, with impact stuff, it's not getting any better. What do I do? So let's talk about the symptom piece first. The symptom piece, how do we kind of navigate that? We've got impact to navigate. And then I think kind of gait training and like the run piece of it. So with the symptoms, I think typically you can do a lot of the basic retraining stuff from a core perspective and hip strength perspective, even balance stuff, because typically those things aren't going to make you symptomatic. So if you're looking for kind of where to start on this, again, I typically use a return to run readiness screen, regardless of what you're going back to, because it screens out those items and gives you a place to start. Now, that said, you can pass all those items and be symptomatic in running. You cannot pass all those items and still run without symptoms. So again, it's just a tool. We don't have anything written in stone. All right, so let's talk about symptoms. If you have leakage, that requires a little bit of a deeper dive. If you have prolapse symptoms of heaviness, it requires a deeper dive. I think those things will tend to dictate when you can start running. If you have symptoms during regular daily activities, or is it just running? I think that's going to impact that 12-week timeline, because you might just need to do a bit more foundation building to kind of get stuff back. But this is where also, again, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, our understanding of what is going on in the pelvic floor with leakage, what is going on in the pelvic floor with prolapse, I think that has evolved and changed. Um, that's just general information. And then I think we are finally starting to understand symptomatic versus asymptomatic. Like, what are the anatomical differences? What are the muscle strategy differences? Like, and I think honestly, with I don't know that our explanations are right. I think we're stumbling upon interventions that are working. I don't know if our explanations are right, and problem is we don't have research at this point. So, let's take stress incontinence, for example. I think for a very, very long time, we were all trained, and this has kind of spilled over into the public, a strong pelvic floor and you'll be fine, right? And now and I think the understanding was if you have the ability to contract and relax your pelvic floor and it is strong, it will support the bladder and hold back urine when you run and jump. And that is an incredible oversimplification and actually not accurate of what the pelvic floor levator ani muscles actually do. And that's that whole, like we called it a hammock for a really long time. I think that's an oversimplification. So I think the more we get into this complex stuff, we have to go back and be aware of these changing understandings of what actually is happening with some of these basic issues. Um, so what we're starting to understand a little bit more now about stress urinary incontinence is it's not necessarily levator ani dependent. We've got to pay attention with what's going on with our internal and external urethral sphincters. So that tube, what's going on? Is it closing when it's supposed to? Is it able to mitigate pressures above and below? And then the other thing is understanding how intra-abdominal pressure impacts kind of support of the bladder and compression of that urethra against the fascia and that fascia integrity. And that's, again, where I do think pelvic floor muscle training does come in to kind of understand the role of that to tension the tissues and provide support, as well as the position of the bladder and the urethra. If they're high, we tend to be a little bit better. If they get a little bit lower, things seem to be a little bit worse. But again, like, can we impact that from a conservative perspective? So all that stuff aside, okay, and starting to learn kind of what happens in women who don't have symptoms versus symptoms, what is that, how does that translate? And I think where we are now a little bit, and again, I'm trying to figure out, and I'm not there yet, I'll be honest. I think there's been this tendency to err towards this understanding of overactivity. And again, I think we're onto something, but I don't think we are really articulating what's actually happening. We're making these assumptions. Um, but overactivity and high tone has definitely been something where we've been erring for a long time with exercise. We're like, oh, if you have leakage, do Kegels. And then we realized that that wasn't helping everybody. And then we realized, okay, well, if we actually work on relaxation and coordination and then build up strength, does that address symptoms? And it does. But why? And why is it in some people and not others? And again, I think there's more that we need to understand there. And is it why do some people have overactivity? Is it as simple as, kind of how we explain it, where we're like, oh, you're stressed all the time, you're breathing up in here, you've got, TMJ issues. Um, it's going to increase pressure down. Your brain doesn't like that, and so it'll come up in a little bit of overactivity. I love that that kind of makes sense, but my spidey sense says that's not completely accurate, which is really hard. Because on one hand, I'm like, I want to make it simple so that you understand, but there's also a part of me where I'm like, okay, that might not be exactly what's going on, but the strategies that I'm giving you are making your symptoms better. So as a clinician, I need to give you something so that this makes sense so that you do what I want you to do that will make you better, but also understand that uh, I don't think that's exactly what's going on, which is it's good news, bad news. So if you are a newer clinician, you're gonna be like, "What? We don't know what's going on." And if you've been around as long as I have, and you're like, "Yeah, I don't think what we say is going on is exactly that because what we're learning and the research about what's happening with the pelvic floor and the organs and the urethra and the bladder and all that stuff doesn't really match up." So anyway, that's another conversation for another day. All goes to say, we're learning. And sometimes that's backwards. Like we're trying different interventions. It's helping. And then I think then it's going to make us go back and try and figure out whether our explanation is accurate or not. But at the end of the day, if you're, a mom listening to this and you're like, she just went off the rails, um, just know that the interventions that we're giving you are working. We're just full of shit as to why. Um, which is easy to say, and actually kind of exciting, when you've been at this as long as I have, because I love that I don't know everything, and somewhere the answer exists. Anyway, back to kind of what we're talking about. Um, I think we're at an interesting point where a lot of, kind of we're trying to address leakage, trying to address prolapse, and coming into it with, this, like, high tone sort of thing that, again, may or may not be right. But I think the emphasis is good because it steps us back to look at, okay, what is actually going on? Are we able to contract, relax? We're looking at the rest of our day and the potential impact on what's going on down below. We're looking at genetics, how we used our bodies before having kids. It's much bigger picture. We're looking at integrating full body exercise. We're looking at impact. We're looking at strength in the extremities and the ankles, all that kind of stuff. We're looking at balance. I think in that respect, um, we've definitely made a nice shift that has resulted in a lot of people with improvement in symptoms and ability to go from leakage in a run to being dry, or pelvic organ prolapse symptoms in a run to being able to run symptom free. Um, but it really is, kind of collaborative game at that point. So if we know somebody's having symptoms, we're able to do that baseline strengthening. It's like, how do we know when to start? And the first thing, again, is to make sure that they're getting through daily activities without symptoms. Can we gradually expose them to more challenging activities? Can we introduce introductory impact that's less than what they might experience with running? And when we start to introduce running, can we do it in a way, again, that's less than? And so uphill running is something that a lot of people have been playing around with, whether it's outdoors or on a treadmill or things like that. We know that that's going to be less likely to bring on symptoms than downhill running. And I think that if you've had pelvic floor symptoms, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, no, I totally got you there. But uphill is actually even a little bit more than flat, or uphill hiking, or things like that. So again, it's giving us a place to start. Um, but as far as like, okay, do we do this before 12 weeks? Do we wait till after? I don't know that there's ever a circumstance in which I'm going to be like, no. it's not until that 12-week mark. I think there's room for conversation anywhere along the line. And it all is dependent on what's going on with those symptoms, what's going on with um, gradual progression and addition of more challenging tasks. And that's where, again, I think making sure that that foundation is solid and then gradually integrating. And I've been super open about playing around with Goodson's drills, running drills, where she has basically lowest to highest vertical impact force. Am I making a lot of assumptions there that that's what I should be doing? Yeah, 100%. But guess what? It gave me a list of things to play with in a more challenging order. And that's something that I started to dose in. We dose in bouncing. Okay, how does bouncing feel? Let's use that as our warm up. Get your body ready for that. Then, small jumps, and then we progress to lateral movements and multi-directional. And again, it might depend. If you're just going to be on a treadmill, it's going to be a very different progression than if you are a trail runner or a sidewalk runner or things like that, or if you just want to run across the playground and catch your kid. So again, that's where it gets super gray. And if you're not working with somebody, I think it can be incredibly confusing to figure out what to do, because you've got so many voices now being like, hey, do this, do that, do your, um, look at your running cadence, do it. And this is where I am like, no, 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 we need to keep it incredibly simple. Let's see where the gaps are. And let's not stir the pot where we don't have to. And I've said this before. It's like Mom 101. How little do we need to do so no one dies? And I truly believe that PTs like to get too complicated, and moms can't. We ain't got time for that shit. Anyway, point being, figure out where the gaps are, figure out where you need to spend the most time depending on what your symptoms are. If you know the impact's going to be an issue, we sure as heck need to have some sort of impact progression. If we know that you're having some, core deficits, and, rotation stuff is really not your forte, and you're early postpartum, we know that that's a gap. Okay, great. We need something there. Like, make sure that we check those boxes that really are going to make the biggest difference, so that we can say, hey, let's go back to that run walk program sooner. Because ultimately, again, that's the goal. And for some people, they don't mind spreading that out over a several month period of time. Some people want to get back to that run before they go back to work so they can get back into that regular schedule again. But again, to go back to our initial question, it really does depend. So if you don't have somebody that's helping you guide, it's incredibly overwhelming to figure out where to go. And I see people try and navigate it. Even patients sometimes, I'll be like, oh, well, how'd you come out? We treat them for something else, and then they decide they want to run. And I'm like, oh, well, how'd you come out on the run readiness screen? Because I don't need to have them in the office to do that. And they're like, oh, I need to work on my running in place. I'm like, okay, understand what each of those components are. To address running in place, that doesn't mean you just practice running in place. If it were that simple, we'd all be fine. I wouldn't have a job. There's more components to that. If I have somebody that says, hey, I can't do running in place without becoming symptomatic, I'm going to back up, knowing that that's higher up on a vertical impact scale. I'm going to back up and be like, all right, well, what about these other ones? Can you do these other ones symptomatically? I'm going to take them back to just that point where they start to become a little bit vulnerable. And I want them to start there. And then we build back up. It's like, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things. It's not as simple as, oh, I want to get better at running. Just run more. No, we know we need to strengthen. We know we need to work on other things. Like, you can't just do the thing over and over and hope that it just makes you better at it. It's like double unders. Doing more singles isn't going to get you better at double unders. It's just not. You have to do accessory motions. Same thing with pull-ups. Same thing with like any skill. Doing more of them, especially when you can't do it, isn't going to solve the problem. That's where we have to take a step back and figure out, okay, well, what can you do? Where's that edge that you start to have trouble? And then how do we fill the gap between there and the thing that you're having a problem with? And I think that's where having somebody that knows what all those little intermediate steps are, somebody that knows that progression, somebody that can acknowledge, okay, you know what? let's start here. Let's reassess again. Oh, you know what? We can skip some steps and get you there sooner instead of being like, okay, now we do this and then we do this and then we do, and then there's like 17,000 steps that you really didn't need to take in between. Because that will get you recognizing what you need to do to get you to that 12 weeks faster, but also efficiently and safely. I think that's where the benefit is of working with somebody who's running informed or that sport informed or things like that. Because again, there's more generalists that are picking the high points and they're missing those nuances in between, and that's quite honestly where the answers are the nuances. And knowing how to recognize those patterns and skip steps and skip the things you don't need to do and really focus on the things that you do need to do. So we talked about symptoms, we talked about impact, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about was kind of when you finally get to whatever that mark is. So whether we're before 12 weeks or after 12 weeks, honestly, at this point, it really doesn't matter. I see so many people, and I've spoken about this before, doing the couch to 5K, 1 minute on, 1 minute off. I don't, again, we don't have any data to support any of this. In my opinion, I don't think that's enough rest. And even if you, again, the 4-phase approach paper with Shefali Christopher, there's some recommendations there, and I think probably I've got to go back and see where that comes from, and probably chat with Shefali because I don't necessarily agree with it, because it starts with the rest is always the same, but as you progress, the work part gets longer, but the rest is always the same, and they do it based upon mileage. Um, so a couple issues I have with that. One, the average person doesn't know mileage. I mean, even if you carry around your Garmin, like time is so much easier. And I think that's also too why we go on RPE versus pace. Unless again, this is your day job, we're going to be concerned about kind of just how we feel about our intensity of exertion. But if you're going more with the same amount of rest, um, what if it doesn't work? What if I gave you just 30 seconds more rest and you could still do more? And so that's where I do this like sort of progression where we start 1 minute on, 4 off, and we do that several times. Um, we do that 4 within the session if we can. We adjust if we need to, but we do that 2 to 3 separate sessions. Um, and we do that for a couple of reasons. Again, zero data other than, clinically what I've done with clients over the years. If something goes wrong, we nab it sooner. Or let's say things go great the first time, they don't go great the second time, the third time they're fine. Great, I think we're probably okay. But if you're changing a variable every single time, then you don't know what it's going to be, or then you're going to go down the rabbit hole and be like, oh my god, what happened? Do I need to start over? That whole fear factor comes in, and if you've had leakage or prolapse symptoms, fear factor is real. So I think I really do think that repetition of sessions is normal, or I'm sorry, not normal, but like beneficial. And then we progress up. So 2 on, 3 off, 3 on, 2 off, 4 on, 1 off. So as our work increases, our rest decreases, but it's still a decent amount of rest. Like not for nothing, it's still allowing us to rest and then repeat that. And that's something that I think I learned from working with women with issues with jump rope and singles and doubles is if let's say they leak at 30. Well, what if we stop at 25 and you rest for 10 seconds, which is an eternity in a workout. If you've ever done this before, you feel like everybody's staring at you. Then you can do 25 more versus let's say you go to 30, stop for like 2 seconds, and then you can't do 5 more. Like, what if we dosed more rest in and it would allow us to actually stack up and add more load to our training? And then we can slowly start to decrease our rest. And in a lot of cases, that works. But if you never give enough rest to recover in the middle of it, you'll never know. And then you're stuck at that. And it's the same thing again with our person we were talking about, who's like, oh, I just need to practice running in place. I'm like, no, that's not it. Just doing more of it. Doesn't, like, you can't do more jump ropes to make it so that you don't leak. You have to find a way to keep nudging that ceiling and bumping it up. You can't just be like, all right, I'm gonna go to the wall every single time. I'm gonna go to the well and that I'm just gonna get more. I'm like, no, that's not how it works with dysfunction. That's how it works if you're trying to build training load without issues, but it is not how it works when you're trying to navigate leakage, pelvic organ pressure, pain, things like that. Yeah. So I guess the moral of the story here is if you're looking at this from an evidence based perspective, you're not going to find papers. If you come at this from an evidence informed, and I do think that those are different, we look at the data that we have and we make the best decision with the person in front of us, understanding that it might be sooner than 6 weeks. It might be longer than 12 weeks. It might be somewhere between 6 to 12. And if you are trying to be the most efficient with what that looks like for you, there's a lot of factors to consider. And it may be to your benefit to sit down with somebody who is a running or sport informed pelvic floor physical therapist who can kind of articulate what those variables are, what's going on with any symptoms that you're having, what are potential things that might pop up that might interrupt that. So, baby's sick, you got to navigate tongue tie surgery, like who knows, breastfeeding, sleep, whatever. And understand that it's going to get put off a little bit when these things happen, and they do, and that's fine. It's such a blip of time. But I think having those conversations to set expectations, but then also knowing yourself, what's driving your need to get back sooner? Is it your mental health? And again, that's not a bad thing. We just need to know how to mitigate it. Are you concerned about needing to drop the baby weight? So you're more apt to underfuel and overtrain. Does that put you at more risk for low energy availability? And we need to have conversations about bone stress injuries. Like, do you have a history of bone stress injuries? Do you have a history of eating disorders? Like, having those conversations so we can understand the variables at play, that's going to allow us to be more accurate on where you're going to fit in that continuum. If you're trying to DIY this yourself, again, the accuracy isn't going to be as much, especially if it's your first time around and you're new at navigating this. I think if you've navigated this before, also understanding that one postpartum will not be the same as the other, but you do have a little bit better sense of how you navigate certain things, but you also are going to have more kids. So it's a little bit different situation. But again, when at all possible, try and do it in such a way that you're considering all the variables at play, and that's going to allow you to, I think, temper your expectations or allow you to not necessarily fall victim as much to the comparison game because I am not Greth Arnold. I am not Sophie Power. I am not like Tia Toomey. I am not Annie Daughter. Like, I know I am not those people, but that doesn't mean that I'm still not looking at them being like, well, why can they do that stuff and I cannot? Like, you're still going to do it. It's a lot easier to kind of sit down with somebody who can be objective about all of it, especially without the hormones, and be like, all right, this is what your current situation is. Tell me what your goals are. Let's walk it back and let's see where we can be realistic on this. So, in summary, is 12 weeks on the mark? I don't know. I don't know your situation. If you want to chat about it, if that's something that you want to do, I work with clients virtually. Obviously, here in the DC area, I work with people in person. I have quick DM conversations with people just to point them in the right direction or connect them to resources in their area. Happy to have those conversations because I think the more we can get people prepared and get expectations set, the more likely we are to be able to kind of I don't know, set ourselves up for success and get our heads in the right spot and know what we need and kind of be able to ask for help and delegate out and that kind of stuff too. Um, but again, we didn't know this 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago. So for those of you that are listening to this because you're, in perimenopause too, and you didn't get caught up on that stuff that moms are doing now, or you just ran and see how it went, and now your hormones are going for a loop, and you're like, okay, now I need to go back and fill in the gap and all that stuff. Like, there's still ways to do this. There's no limit to when you can go back and kind of do this process. At the end of the day, we need to understand all the variables at play, where the gaps are that we need to fill in, and would it benefit you to get there faster and more efficiently if that's what you want, to bring somebody in that it's their literal day job to do this, and they're really good at problem solving those pieces and giving you a progression that makes sense for you, your family, your situation, kind of all of those things. So anyway, if you have questions about any of this, please let me know. You can hop in my DMs on Instagram at Carrie Pagliano. Would love to hear from you. If you like these solo episodes, definitely hop in and let me know. So far, you guys have enjoyed them and been listening to them, so I appreciate that. If you have 2 seconds, please go ahead and hop over to your podcast listener of choice and give us 5 stars. That way, more moms can hear and get the good information of the stories that we share. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you want any more of these solo episodes. We'll definitely keep them going if you guys have stuff that you want to hear. Have a good one. Did you enjoy the podcast? If so, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes and tell a friend to do the same. Are you a postpartum mom or postpartum pro wanting to know more about getting back to running after baby? Check out all my free goodies on carriepagliano.com. This podcast represents the opinions of Dr. Carrie Pagliano and her guests to the show. The content should not be taken as medical advice and is for entertainment purposes only. Always consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions.